welcome to this first episode of Frick 5. I am Xavier Salomon, the Jay Sharp Chief Curator at the Frick Collection. And today I'm here with Nathaniel Silver from Boston. He is the William and Leah Poorvu Curator of the collection at the Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum in Boston. But of course, he was a colleague of ours at the Frick between 2010 and 2012. He was the Andrew W. Mellon curatorial fellow at the Frick, and he curated the wonderful Piero della Francesca in America exhibition in 2013. Since he's been at the Gardner, he has worked on wonderful exhibitions on Fra Angelico, on Botticelli, on Raphael, and his most recent show is Boston's Apollo, the wonderful story of the relationship between Sargent and one of his models, Thomas McKellar. So welcome, Nat. Great to see you.
Thanks, Xavier. It's such fun to be here with you.
So we start with the 5 questions that the Frick is going to ask a number of colleagues, friends, and curators. And just to get to know you a bit better and to chat about art a little bit. So what is the work of art or the museum that changed your life?
So the work of art that changed my life is Titian's Flaying of Marsyas. And there's kind of a story behind that. When I was 10 years old, I was in Washington, D.C. with my parents on a trip. And one afternoon, we ended up going to the National Gallery. I should say that it was the last place I really wanted to go. I actually really wanted to take the tour of the FBI building, but nobody else in my family wanted to do it. And so I was dragged to the National Gallery, where my parents took me in to see an exhibition that was going on there. And I was so bored. I kind of made my way through the galleries with very little interest in the art until I could find a place to sit in the final gallery. And that's where my parents found me as they were finishing the exhibition. Sitting on a bench, looking at this painting, crying. And that was a really powerful experience because it was the first time I realized that you could have a visceral reaction to a work of art, something that was just purely emotional. I had no idea what was going on in this painting, but I could tell that it was something pretty awful. And of course, now I know that it's a mythological story about the satyr Marsyas, who challenges Apollo to a contest, who has the hubris to do this, and who's punished for his hubris by being skinned alive. And it's a terrifying picture of the world turned upside down. And you can see it even in the little dog at the bottom, this lapdog that's been transformed into a ravening beast that licks the blood up that's dripping down Marsyas's body. So it was a very memorable experience and one that, I'll never forget.
When you've seen this work again, or when you see it illustrated, do you think back to that emotion of when you were a kid? Does it come back?
Yeah, I do. Now that I am a curator, I'm responsible for a collection that includes a great work by Titian. Of course, I think of Titian as, a painter who means a lot to me, who's part of my job as an art historian who I write about. But really, when I see this particular picture, which is, today in the Czech Republic, it belongs to the Kromeritz Palace. When I see images of it, it takes me back to that moment when I was 10 years old at the National Gallery, where I just had this very emotional response. And that's sometimes difficult to have today, because as an art historian, you think of so many other things before you think of the emotion sometimes. So it sometimes reminds me to get back to that first impression.
And it's strange to think how sometimes these things go round in circles. Actually, the exhibition you've worked on most recently that's coming up at the Gardner will be the first reunion ever of Titian's Poesie. So back to Titian a few years later.
That's right. It sort of started with Titian, you could say, long before I even knew what being an art historian or a curator meant. And now we're coming back to Titian this year, starting in London, that opened shortly before, at the beginning of March, and then it'll be coming here to Boston in 2021. And so we're hugely looking forward to that.
Wonderful. So you live at the Stewart Gardner with what I would argue is the best Titian in America, if not one of the best Titian paintings ever, with The Rape of Europa. But what is the work that you would want to live with every day in your home?
Well, the work that I would want to live with every day is Piero della Francesca's Baptism, which lives in the National Gallery in London. Now, I'm been lucky enough to work at two of the three museums in the United States that own Piero della Francesca's, first at the Frick, then at the Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum, where we own the fresco of his famous Hercules. My wife works at the third, the Clark, which owns his magnificent Virgin and Child with Angels. So it seems only appropriate that we bring a Piero into our home. But kind of joking aside, this painting means a lot to me in two respects. One, it really speaks to me about the time of my graduate studies that I spent in London over the course of 6 years, both studying at the Courtauld Institute and University College London, eventually for my PhD, and working at Christie's. And I'd go to the National Gallery, and I remember the first time I went there, seeing this painting and being completely mesmerized by it, the stillness and the light, but not really knowing how to put that into words. And then the other side of it, which really speaks to me, is its location in Italy. You know, Piero painted this baptism against an incredible landscape. And it's an Italian landscape, and Italy has been a touchstone in my career and continues to be, because I study Italian Renaissance art. The Isabella Stewart Gardner collection is one of the great collections of Renaissance art in the United States, among other paintings, the Piero that I mentioned, the Hercules, the Titian's Rape of Europa that you mentioned. And this landscape is not just Italy and reminds me of my travels and studies in Italy, but it's a very specific landscape. Piero relocated the biblical story of the baptism in front of his hometown of Borgo San Sepolcro. And you can actually see it if you look just to the left of Christ's hip. There's a tiny little walled city there. And that straight line right in front of it is the straight road that runs to Anghiari, the village nearby. And then in the background, you see the mountains of the moon. And then that river, that he's transformed a river just outside the walls of his town, the River Dafra, into the River Jordan. So that place is a place that meant a lot to him because it was his hometown. And it came to mean a lot to me because when I was working on my exhibition that you mentioned for the Frick collection on Piero della Francesca, which opened in 2013, I spent a lot of time in San Sepolcro. And so I got to know this particular landscape really well.
I remember when we were in San Sepolcro together, when you were working on that show, and how this was used for the adverts for water in San Sepolcro, which I always thought was very funny.
That's right. There's a fountain just outside one of the gates where you can fill up your water bottles and put them in your car, and it's got Christ being baptized in this painting right on the side of it.
I also find it interesting that what first moved you to art was something so completely different from this, in a way, like the violence, the drama of the Titian, and then the stillness and the sort of wonderful feeling of the baptism. It's so different.
This is such a contrast. I totally agree, and it's that feeling actually that first attracted me to this painting when I first saw it in London, which was being mesmerized by that stillness and by that precision, the precision of the way that the light is falling, that kind of sense of arrested movement in John's right hand over Christ's head. But then, you know, again, coming back to what you learn as an art historian, there are all these other layers now that really speak to me about the place. And, you know, even right down to the walnut tree over Christ's head and how important that was in the foundation legend of the city. So there's this kind of contrast between the emotions, which are the first response, and then the sort of knowledge and the book knowledge, you could say, that comes later.
So let's move away from paintings for a second, and let's think about other artistic worlds. So what is the book, and what is the piece of music or type of music that most inspire you?
Okay, so the book is Il Gatto Pardo by Lampedusa. This is a magnificent, very romantic novel. I came to it for the first time. I read it for the first time in college. I think I was in my second year, and I was taking a course on modern Italian history. And of course, that's exactly what's at the heart of this novel, the moment of unification in the 19th century, when, you know, Italy is transforming from these multiple city-states and principalities into a single unified country. And at the heart of the novel are a group of characters who are at this together, are living at this inflection point in the history of Sicily and the history of Italy. And these two moments in history are coming together, this old world and this new world. And it's clear that one is going to be destroyed and one is going to grow into something new and powerful. But it also, it paints the picture of this very dramatic story against the landscape of Italy and, Sicily in particular, and the interiors of these houses, the palazzo where the Prince of Salina lives, you know, where against the battleground where Tancredi is fighting. So it's in a way this very romantic landscape.
I always love the passage in the book where it says that everything has to change for everything to stay the same. And I always think of that as the world goes by and in many ways stays the same, yet changing dramatically. It's a very profound book. It's a very beautiful book.
I think it's a very profound book. I agree. And it's also sort of understated. I feel like people forget how profound it is because it kind of gets left out of the canon a little bit, but it's a wonderful story.
Yeah, and I always love the fact that actually, you know, everyone refused to publish it when he wrote it, and it was only really published and had any success after he died posthumously, and it sort of was this rediscovery later on. Like many great masterpieces, they're not appreciated when they actually come out. But
absolutely, and the author was in a way sort of like the Prince of Salina a little bit. He had this very tragic life in a way. These kind of hopes unrealized during his lifetime.
Yeah. So what about music?
Music. Okay. So for music, we go somewhere very different. So for me, jazz has always been very important. And I can trace that back to one very specific experience. In fourth grade, we all had to choose an instrument. I chose the saxophone. I played the alto saxophone for probably 10 years. I was pretty bad, but no lack of enthusiasm. And one day I discovered that, and I can't remember whether it was somebody who told me this or whether I saw it in the newspaper, but there was going to be a jazz concert at a small theater in the town where my school was. And this is a kind of, I still remember this theater, it's still there. It has the kind of marquee out front with the awning, with all the little lights in it, and you know the names in the little tiled plastic letters that go out in front of it. And a performer named Sonny Rollins was performing on the tenor sax. So I got a ticket and I went, and I didn't really know anything about him. And I was totally blown away. I mean, by his music, by his solos. I mean, the concert went on, and there were several ovations, standing ovations at the end, and then he'd play again. And it just completely opened my eyes to what jazz is. Of course, I left and realized shortly thereafter that Sonny Rollins was and is the greatest living jazz saxophonist. So it felt like a brush with someone really great. And I went back over and over again to that theater, which is this tiny theater, but brought these incredible names. Lionel Hampton was another one, Dave Brubeck, Wynton Marsalis, and I could go and see them as a teenager, and I just felt incredibly lucky.
That's great. So back to art and paintings. Who do you think is the most overrated artist and the most underrated?
So for overrated artist, I'd have to go for Leonardo. There's been so much Leonardo going on in the last couple of years, and I'm kind of getting sick of it. That's partly because of what you see here, which is people not actually going to look at Leonardo, but going to kind of have the experience of taking a Leonardo picture on their phones. And that experience is only fueled by kind of huge blockbuster exhibitions around an artist who actually wasn't that great a painter. And not that many of his paintings survive, but from what we can see, you know, there were many better painters at the time. Where he really excelled, I think, is as a draftsman, and it's absolutely magnificent to see his drawings. But, you know, they're protected for conservation reasons. They can only be shown for a few months at a time. And so that, you know, that really is a rare experience, but it's really these big shows with paintings in them that seem to have created this kind of industry. And it's an industry not just in exhibitions, but in publications too. I think no other artist has spawned a kind of publication industry in quite the way that Leonardo has, to the point where there are people who have just spent their entire careers focusing on Leonardo alone. I think when people sometimes think about art historians, they you know, they think of us as sort of fusty or, you know, very narrowly focused. And we play to that stereotype if we think about, you know, a scholar who has just studied one artist for his or her entire career. And I would hope that all of us, you know, embrace many different artists, many different periods, and extend our interest beyond any one painter or sculptor or draftsperson, no matter how good that person is.
It's also, I think there are different factors as well. I mean, one is the quality of the projects around it. So as much as there have been some very good exhibitions about Leonardo, most of the things that tend to happen are these sort of tourist traps about, you know, Leonardo's machines or things like that. And the same way with books, you know, if I think of Kenneth Clark's book on Leonardo, is an amazing book, but then there are so many books about, you know, the recently discovered new Leonardo or the secret behind the Mona Lisa. And obviously those are the sort of things that make us look at this artist in a sort of in the wrong way. And then I think also it's the idea of thinking of him in a vacuum. You know, Leonardo as this lonely single genius, and no one is really thinking about the context around him and all the other artists, painters, sculptors, and people working around him, with him. And it's sort of, you know, this lonely genius idea that it's so wrong in many ways.
Yeah, you know, I totally agree with you. And especially, you know, the second point you're making about this lone genius, we all know that's a complete fallacy, whether it's Leonardo or Michelangelo or Raphael or anyone. They had workshops, they worked with many assistants. You know, he has patrons who are Botticelli's patrons. He has patrons who are many other artists' patrons. So the putting him back in that context, I think, helps. And right now it feels like not a lot of that's getting done.
Yeah, and the sort of iconic thing of the Mona Lisa as well is so fascinating. I mean, when you think of Leonardo as a painter, I would argue there are better portraits than the Mona Lisa. I mean, the Cecilia Gallerani, for example, is much more beautiful. And yet this has become this sort of image that we as art historians don't quite know how to deal with her anymore. It's a sort of icon for like sort of pop culture more than a work of art that we treat as a work of art. So what about underrated?
Underrated artists are more fun to talk about. So This is one of my favorite artists, Francesco Mocchi. Mocchi is one of the great unsung heroes of the Italian Baroque. If Bernini hadn't come along, he probably would be known to everybody. I came across Mocchi for the first time, I think it was 4 or 5 years ago, when I visited the city of Orvieto in Italy. And I was there doing research for a Gardner exhibition project on something completely different, on Simone Martini. And I knew that there was this sculpture by a sculptor who I wasn't very familiar with. And so I went to see it in the museum. And it wasn't actually a museum. It was located at the time in this deconsecrated church at the other side of the city to the cathedral and to most of the main tourist attractions. And you take quite a long road to get there. And you get to this little church, you open the door and no one's there. And there's this incredible angel of the Annunciation in front of you. And it just took my breath away. The dynamism, that energy, that sense of kind of almost like a divine vortex that angel is caught up in, manifested in the drapery around its waist and around its arm. And the fact that it's not, it's not standing on the ground. I think Annunciation scenes can often be quite static. And this is like the complete opposite. The angel is completely in the air with one hand skyward and one hand in front of its leg. And this was a figure made by Mochi as part of a group of sculpture for the cathedral in Orvieto around 1602, I believe. And one of the exciting things is that it's now gone from this church where it was for many years, off the beaten track where really no one saw it, back into the cathedral for the first time in like 200 years. And that happened only last fall. So now you can see it where it was actually intended to be seen. And you can really appreciate just how daring it is. I mean, this was a breakout work for Mochi right at the beginning of his career. And you can see how he must have captured everyone's attention with it.
It's an amazing work. I actually remember the first time I ever heard of this was when I was a kid. Federico Zeri, the Italian art historian, used to do TV and radio programs about works of, this was a series, I think, about scandals in the Italian world of art, and the fact that these sculptures were stored at the time in the basement, I think it was, of the museum of the Opera del Duomo, because they didn't know where to put them. And so he was going around and there were these half-open crates with this angel coming out of a crate. And he was saying it was such a scandal that these things were not visible. And I think it was after that, a few years after that, that they were put in the church where you first saw it and where I first saw it, actually. And it's great. I agree that it's back in the cathedral where it belongs. I mean, it's an extraordinary thing.
That story about the crate is so wonderful too, because it speaks to the nature of this piece of sculpture, that it's a figure that can't be contained. It's literally breaking out of any convention at that time. If you want to know more about Mochi, there's actually a fantastic book published in English a couple of years ago by Estelle Limbo called
It's a great book.
It's a great book.
It's a great book. So a final question for you. So if you could be portrayed by anyone ever, who would that be?
I would choose a contemporary artist named Firali Baez. And this is really a story with a Frick connection, but not the Frick in New York, the Frick in Pittsburgh. About 3 or 4 years ago, I was invited to give a lecture at the Frick House in Pittsburgh. So not known so much for its art collection, but more all of the kind of everyday life of the Frick family. And so like any good art historian, while I was in Pittsburgh, I took advantage of visiting museums I'd never been to before. And one of them that was first on my list was the Warhol Foundation in Pittsburgh, a fantastic place. I really went to get a better sense of the Warhol works that are there. And I walked in to discover that there's this exhibition on by an artist I'd never heard of, Firali Baez. The exhibition is called Bloodlines. And I was completely struck by her work in this exhibition. Much of it was drawing or watercolor on paper. And I've always been a huge fan of works on paper since I worked in the drawings department at Christie's many years ago. And I worked in the drawings department at the Getty as an intern many years ago. And these were kind of huge, lush watercolors on this beautiful single pieces of paper, full-length figure like the one you see in front of you, with these magnificent patterns, floral patterns, palmette patterns. There was clearly so much talent here, and all really poured into these really exuberant subjects and kind of investing them with a certain kind of regal quality. And I just thought, when you asked me that question, if there is somebody who I'd love to paint my portrait, I think it would be Baez, because there is this just real more is more quality that, as a curator at the Gardner Museum, really speaks to that aesthetic that Isabella Stewart Gardner had, and that I kind of live with every day there. The patterning of the textiles with the ceramics, with the paintings, with the furniture. And what was so wonderful about it in this particular exhibition of Baez's work in Pittsburgh was that she took over the whole space, so that those textures and those patterns and those colors within the works of art on paper bled through the frames into the walls themselves, because she had actually painted and drawn on the walls of the exhibition gallery itself. And you can see that here in the installation photo you have.
I love looking at this painting as well, thinking to some of the exhibitions you curated, how much of Botticelli and how much of Fra Angelico is in there as well, in terms of the ornament, the decoration. It's sort of, in many ways, it's going back to some of those ideas.
Absolutely is. And, you know, you could even extend that analogy to Crivelli as well, who is a master of ornament, right? And applied ornament. Yeah. And you really see that in Baez's work, the way that ornament speaks for identity, in the same way that I think in Crivelli's work, ornament speaks for a kind of regional identity or local identity. You know, there's one other attraction about Baez's work that I have to mention, though. And that was a more recent realization, which is I found out a year ago that she had been commissioned to create a mosaic cycle for a subway station in New York, in Washington Heights. And suddenly that made her work even more poignant to me, because that was the neighborhood where I was born, at Columbia Presbyterian Hospital, and where we lived for the first few years of my life. So this choice of an artist who I had seen her work in Pittsburgh and who I was just blown away by also became very, very personal in a kind of biographical way as well.
And it's very funny that you're speaking to us from Boston. I am speaking to you from Washington Heights. So full circle, I'm just a few blocks away from the hospital you were born in. Exactly. So this is one of the great advantages of technology. But thank you so much, Nat, for this. I would encourage everyone to look online at the Stewart Gardner website and look at Boston's Apollo. There's a lot of material on it online, and hopefully the exhibition will be open until some point this fall. And then we all look forward to Titian's Poesia in Boston as well. Thank you so much, Nat.
Thank you, Xavier. It's always a pleasure talking about art with you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.